Hi there. Hi, Amber. How are you? Hi, Kay. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Dolores on Facebook, and hi, Dolores on YouTube. Thanks for coming. Please share. Looks like we have a pretty small contingent tonight. Maybe people are tired of hearing about Joe Manchin. I don't know. But he's really got to be handled. And the reason why, of course, is if he's allowed to block things, we are all done. We are all done because we're not going to start at all on the Green New Deal, and we just won't have the time. We're just not going to finish working on it on time in order to avert a disaster. Why? Well, because if he blocks everything, then the 22 and probably in 2024, and we won't get a chance to start anything significant until 2028, 2029 actually. So we'll have had 8 wasted years. We can't have that right now. It can't happen. Hi, Lana. Amber says, I'm just getting off work, dreaming of vacation on the Oregon coast in July. Is the Oregon coast any prettier than the Washington coast, Amber? Anyway, time to take a look at the public opinion situation. Time to take a look at what the people want. There's an article that appeared in Common Dreams, and you'll be looking at it in just a minute. I guess you're looking at it now. I didn't realize I had shared it, but I guess I did. So, this was from Common Dreams, and here are a bunch of people standing in front of the Capitol, that looks like, with a sign saying for the people. No, they're standing in front of the Supreme Court to call on the Senate to pass the For the People Act, which makes me wonder why they weren't standing in front of the Senate. Anyway, the title of it is Freeing the Muzzled Majority Beneath Polarization, quote unquote, surprising by unity. And she says Americans are not divided on democracy. Who is she? Frances Moore Lappe. This was published on June 11th. (2021). And she says, laments over America's political polarization mount. Actions of the president and his party are pulling us further apart, argued Senator Tim Scott, Republican, South Carolina, responding to President Biden's address in late April. Polarization is the story of American politics today, observes by Fareed Zakaria of CNN. I think Tim Scott really has a lot of nerve. What does he expect of the Democrats to do? Simply to give in to everything the Republicans want, or everything the Republicans don't want? He's causing polarization because he doesn't want to do what we want. Such framing obscures the real threat, the attack underway on democracy itself. And so, Merriam-Webster defines democracy as, quote, government by the people, especially rule of the majority, unquote. Well, that's certainly one definition. So defined, it is not merely Democrats that Republicans appear to be fighting, as they pursue legislation undermining majority rule. Democracy itself is their target. Overall, legislators have introduced at least 389 bills with restrictive provisions in 48 states, reports the Brennan Center. They restrict voting and much more. Earlier this month, a statement of concern from more than 100 democracy scholars across the country decried that such legislation, quote, could entrench extended minority rule, unquote. So we should be alarmed, but not surprised that in its 2021 annual ranking of countries by their political rights and civil liberties, Freedom House found the United States dropping significantly from 94 to 83. 17 places from the top, placing us between Morocco and Romania. Isn't that amazing? Moreover, focusing on our divisions, didn't Joe Biden just say we're the greatest democracy in the world? You know, sounds like the old days of Stalin and the Soviet Union, when he insisted that the Soviet Union was a wonderful democracy. Just look at their constitution. Isn't this a better constitution than the United States even? Moreover, focusing on our divisions can blind us to the considerable evidence that the majority of Americans align on many key challenges we face today. Here are the 12 big ones. Nearly 8 in 10 Americans favor limits on both raising and spending money in congressional campaigns. So where are the limits? Where are the limits? 84% of Americans agree that politicians have too much economic power, and 82% agree that the rich and big corporations have too much, I take it that's economic power also. So, 84% of Americans think that, but 2% more Americans think that politicians have too much economic power than think that the rich and big corporations have too much economic power. And what does that say to you? Isn't that not even just a little backwards? Isn't that ridiculous? Yeah, the politicians would have too much economic power if they hadn't been bribed by the rich and big corporations and the wealthy people. 6 in 10 of us believe that upper income Americans do not pay enough in taxes, while 64% are bothered, either some or a lot, that corporations are not paying their fair tax share. I'm sure they're bothered, but what do you suppose the 64% think is their fair tax share? I'll bet not too many of them would be prepared to guess at that. 78% of Americans, including 80% of Republicans, oppose the Supreme Court's 2010 Citizens United ruling unleashing even more money in politics. Isn't that an amazing statistic? The Republicans themselves, the voter Republicans, oppose the very decision that has given their party so much power. Sometimes polling results are truly amazing. 84% favored paid family leave. Where is that Where is that paid family leave in the greatest democracy in the world? When 84% favor it, where is it? I don't see it. And 2/3 support a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. And where's that? Even had it passed the Congress, even had it not been torpedoed recently by Democrats who aren't willing to stand up for it, it still wouldn't have been $15 an hour. It would have been $15 an hour by 2025, 4 years from now. But it wasn't $15 an hour now. Most Americans, including 70% of Republicans and 92% of Democrats, favor closing gun sale loopholes by enforcing background checks for private gun sales and at gun shows. I notice she doesn't tell us what the percent of independents is, but usually the percent of independents is somewhere between the percent of Republicans and the percent of Democrats. So we're probably looking at 80% of all voters favor closing gun sale loopholes by enforcing background checks for private gun sales and gun shows. And that's another thing we don't have. What kind of democracy is this? 77% of Americans now believe the U.S. should prioritize the development of renewable energy over expanding fossil fuel production. And here's the federal government still expanding fossil fuel production. And 68% favor increased federal spending on green and renewable energy. And of course, we're still waiting to see that come out of Congress, aren't we? 71% favor changing the healthcare system so that any American can buy into a government-run healthcare plan if they want to. So, 71% is favoring a public option. That's what that is, isn't it? You can buy into a government-run healthcare plan if you want to. When they say they favored that, but do you think that they think that the government-run healthcare plan is going to be cheaper than the private sector healthcare plan? So what they really want is a government-run healthcare plan that is cheaper than the private sector healthcare plans. That's what they want to join if they want to. But Congress has never passed a public option of any kind, and certainly not one where the government healthcare plan would be cheaper than the private healthcare plans. After all, they don't want the government healthcare plan to drive the private healthcare plans out of business, do they? 71% think that most immigrants living in the United States illegally should be offered a chance to apply for legal status. 71% are against overturning Roe v. Wade. 77% agree that racism is a serious problem in the United States, and 72% say racism is a serious problem in policing. Regarding for the People Act, HR 1 and S1, with strong democracy protecting measures addressing voting rights, money in politics, and gerrymandering, Data for Progress's new survey revealed that 2/3 of likely voters are in favor. Here we see that in critical ways, the narrative of a divided nation is false. It's taken hold in part, perhaps because it taps into a human tendency to construct dichotomies, to adopt black and white thinking when faced with stress and uncertainty, but the framing harms us as it undermines hope and stymies action. So, if you are surprised by these wide points of unity, consider a critical lesson. While often we hear that seeing is believing, for humans, the opposite is true. Quote, believing is seeing, unquote. We see what we expect to see. We all have a lens, and that affects what we see. If we're constantly told we live in a politically divided world, we risk seeing only evidence that confirms this frame. Let us free ourselves by embracing our wide areas of agreement. In so doing, we stoke hope and find courage to act. Now is the moment. Acting on our unity, we can heed the Brennan Center's call. Quote, access to the vote is an unprecedented peril, but Congress can protect it. The For the People Act, passed by the House and now awaiting action in the Senate, would block many of the state-level restrictions that have been or may soon be enacted into law. Inspired by our impressive unity, we each can sign the open letter to Senator Joe Manchin, sponsored by Equal Citizens, calling on him to ensure passage of the For the People Act now. Manchin's claim that he needs bipartisanship to pass H.R. 1 has already been met. Americans are not divided on democracy. We can make our voices heard. They are part of a beautiful harmony. Our work is licensed under Creative Commons, CC by NC-ND 3.0. Feel free to republish and share widely. And Frances Moore Lappe is the author of 19 books, beginning with the acclaimed Diet for a Small Planet. Most recently, she's the co-author with Adam Eichen of the new book, Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Okay. Among our numerous previous books are Echo Mind, Changing the Way We Think to Create the World We Want, and Democracy's Edge, Choosing to Save Our Country by Bringing Democracy to Life. She is co-founder of the Cambridge, Massachusetts-based Small Planet Institute. Follow her on Twitter at FM Lappe. So, I think she made her point. According to the opinion polls, we are not sharply divided. We have a high degree of unity. But what we see in the media, what we see on the streets, what we see among the elites are sharp divisions in certain respects and not so sharp divisions, in others. After all, how can the divisions be so sharp when the political elites all accept contributions from the same rich people and the very same donor corporations? So, our next piece, on the foundation of unity of opinion. Our next piece is a very interesting one from The Atlantic. I'm sharing it now. And it says, democracy is already dying in the States. This is by Ron Brownstein, a very well-known columnist certainly part of the establishment. The subtitle is Republicans Around the Country Are Proving Joe Manchin Wrong. It is dated June 11th, 2021. While Senator Joe Manchin is demanding that both parties agree on any further federal voting rights by legislation, a new study quantifies how completely Republicans have excluded Democrats from the passage of the restrictive voting laws proliferating in states. In places such as Florida, Georgia, Arizona, Iowa, Kansas, the most restrictive laws approved this year have passed on total or near complete party line votes, with almost all state legislative Republicans voting for the bills, and nearly all Democrats uniting against them, according to an analysis of state voting records provided exclusively to The Atlantic by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. That pattern of unrelenting partisanship has left many state-level Democrats incredulous at the repeated insistence by Manchin, a conservative Democrat from West Virginia, that he will support new federal voting rights by legislation, only if at least some Republican senators agree to it. Manchin is acting like Republicans and Democrats are working together on this stuff, and Republicans in Arizona have completely shut the Democrats out of the legislative process, unquote. That quote was from Katie Hobbs, the Democratic Secretary of State there. And she said that to Brownstein during an interview. Similarly, Jennifer Konfrst, it's spelled Konfrst, it's probably Konfrst, I don't know how to pronounce it. The Democratic whip in the Iowa House of Representatives said, that's a quote from Jennifer Konfrst, quote, "It is unfathomable to me that we would look at this issue and say, we have to bring Republicans along in this political climate in order to make true change. I don't see anywhere where Republicans are inviting Democrats along or inviting Democrats to the table. Why are some Democrats saying, quote, I won't do that unless it's bipartisan?" Okay, Adam Serwer says Joe Manchin can't have it both ways. In its latest tally of state voting laws, the Brennan Center says since January, 14 states have passed 24 laws restricting voting access. That's not likely to be the final tally, because the center also reports dozens of other restrictive bills are still pending across another 18 states. Of the new restrictions that have already passed, the Brennan Center qualifies 17 in 9 states as, quote, highly restrictive, unquote, imposing the greatest barriers to participation. In all of those 9 states, Republicans hold unified control of both the state legislature and the governorship, except for Kansas, where the GOP legislature overrode the Democratic governor Laura Kelly's veto of their voting changes. Every state legislature Democrat casting a ballot voted against 13 of those 17 laws, according to the Brennan analysis. A single Democratic state House member in Arkansas and Montana, and a single state senator in Wyoming voted for 3 of the other bills. The only bill Brennan classifies as restrictive that drew meaningful Democratic support was a second bill in Arkansas narrowing the forms of identification voters could use at polling places. which a significant number of Democrats from both of the legislative chambers backed. Arkansas voter ID bill, the other 16 restrictive Republican measures won support from just 2 of the 509 state House or Assembly Democrats who voted on them, and just 1 of the 207 Democratic state senators. No Democrat co-sponsored any of these restrictive bills, the Brennan Center found. Meanwhile, no more than a single Republican in either legislative chamber voted against any of these bills, other than 2 measures in Montana, one of which was opposed by 2 Republican state House members, the other by 2 GOP state senators, and an absentee voting bill in Arkansas that 6 Republicans in the state House opposed. Of the 1,143 state House or Assembly Republicans who voted on these restrictive bills, just 12 voted no, including the 6 on that one Arkansas bill. When we get to state Senate Republicans, just 7 of 458 voted no on any of these measures, the Brennan analysis found. This was overwhelmingly a Republican partisan push and effort in the states, says Wendy Weiser, the vice president for democracy at the Brennan Center. The Republican offensive has been spurred by former President Donald Trump disproved claims of widespread voter fraud and abetted by conservative groups such as Heritage Action for America, which has published model principles for reconfiguring voter laws and taken credit for the quick GOP actions in several states. Republicans around the country have dismissed charges from Democrats that the GOP's inability to prove any significant fraud in 2020 shows that the new restrictions are unnecessary, as the Texas Democratic State Representative Jessica Gonzalez put it during the floor debate there, quote, "What are we trying to fix here that is not broken," unquote. In Arizona, the Republican-controlled legislature passed a bill earlier this spring that would remove up to 200,000 votes from the state's permanent early voter rolls, which qualifies residents to automatically receive an absentee ballot for every election. Voting experts anticipate a disproportionate number of those culled as a result to be Latino. No Democrat in either the Arizona State House or Senate voted for final passage of the bill, which was quickly signed into law by Republican Governor Doug Ducey. Hobbs told me that although county election officials may have registered objections directly to the legislatures in terms of the bill, quote, "Nobody was interested in making it better or listening to actual concerns for what we actually would have needed to make election administration more streamlined." Arizona Republicans are still pushing a second provision through the budget that would strip Hobbs's office of its authority to defend the state in election-related lawsuits. Shifting control to the GOP state attorney general only until the end of his current. The next section says, read How America Fractured into 4 Parts, and there's a link to that. In Montana, the GOP-controlled legislature passed several bills restricting access to the ballot. One repealed the state's same-day voter registration system. The second required voters who lack a government ID or a concealed carry gun permit to submit two forms of identification in order to vote. No Democrat voted for either, though a single state House Democrat of the 31 who voted did back a third bill that made reducing hours at polling places easier. Quote, the Republican voter suppression agenda that was passed in Montana was completely one-sided, unquote. Democratic State Senator Bryce Bennett, the vice chair of the State Administration Committee that heard the bills, told me, quote, we were never consulted. These bills were brought up out of their own caucus, and we fought like hell to make sure they weren't passed. But the votes were not there. In Iowa, the Republican-controlled the legislature and GOP Governor Kim Reynolds approved a sweeping bill that cut early voting days, reduced poll hours on Election Day, limited every county, regardless of size, to one ballot drop box, and stripped authority from county election officials while imposing severe penalties on them for infractions, among other revisions. Despite the breadth of those changes, the legislature completed the bill and Reynolds signed it by early March. Quote, it was relatively fast for something that would have a significant impact on voter rules that had been in place for many years. It was one of the first ships to sail in this session of the legislature. State Representative Chris Holt told me, quote, they did not want it dragged out, unquote. No Democrats in either legislative chamber voted for the bill. No Republicans voted against it. Confrist serves on the House State Government Committee that heard the other legislation. She said that during the subcommittee vote, the majority of Republicans expressed openness to changes around the edges of the bill. For instance, on rules governing when county officials could collect the ballot from someone who was housebound, but that none of those changes were included in the final bill. Confrist, who expected to be named the Democratic minority leader next week, added, quote, my sense was the cake was baked by the time it got to us. And any sort of input was window dressing and to give the appearance of bipartisanship, but there wasn't any meaningful bipartisan impact in the product, which is disappointing. In May, during a live appearance on Fox News, Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida signed a sweeping bill that made it more difficult to obtain mail ballots, stiffened voter ID requirements for such requests, reduced the number of drop boxes, and essentially prevented outside groups beyond family members from collecting ballots from voters. No Democrat in either legislative chamber voted for the bill. Every Republican except one state senator supported it. Democratic State Senator Tina Polsky, who sits on the Ethics and Elections Committee that considered the bill, says that unified opposition from bipartisan county election officials persuaded Republicans to back off some of their most extreme proposals, such as completely banning drop boxes, but that Democratic input was limited to extremely peripheral issues, such as rules governing third-party candidates. In Texas, Republicans waited until the final weekend of the legislative session to merge separate restrictive voter bills that had earlier passed the State House and State Senate. The bill, which limited early voting hours, further tightened the state's already restrictive absentee ballot provisions and specifically barred tools that Harris County used last year to increase turnout. Drive-through and 24-hour voting emerged so close to the deadline that Republicans ignored the state Senate rule requiring 24-hour notice before voting on any legislation. The tactic backfired, at least temporarily, when Democrats in the House staged a walkout during the session's final hours that prevented the passage of the legislation. Republican Governor Greg Abbott says He will call a special session to approve it later this year, just for the record. They're having some trouble with that. It turns out that there are Republicans that when they had a chance to go over the legislation, and when people began to see the legislation, there was kind of an outcry, and many of the Republicans don't want to take up the bill again in the special session. So it may be the protests of the Democrats will have done some good in that case. I am not certain, but we shall see. No Democrat had voted for either of those original bills, and Democrats complained that they were completely excluded from the conference committee that crafted the final proposal. Quote, as problematic as the bill itself is, the way that legislation was passed was even more problematic, unquote. Democratic State Senator Beverly Powell said in an interview, I was the only senator representing a majority-minority district on the committee. But I was never invited to participate in that process in any way. I was not invited to a formal meeting regarding legislation, and in fact, basically got to see the final products as they were put forth for the entire Senate to see. Likewise, in the highly contentious struggle over voting bills in Georgia, every Democrat in both chambers voted no, and every Republican in both bodies voted yes. No bipartisanship at all, right? After being steamrolled by Republicans in these debates, many state-level Democrats are mystified by Manchin's declaration that Washington should intervene to protect voting rights only if Senate Republicans agree to do so. Quote, I know Senator Manchin is a former Secretary of State, so I know he knows the subject matter. But in some places in the Deep South, like Texas, the level of voter discrimination is not accidental, it's intentional, and there is no common ground you are going to find with Republicans when it is their sole mission to stop people from voting, unquote. Democratic State Representative Trey Martinez Fisher told me. Bennett from Montana also finds Manchin's position disconnected from his experience on the ground. Quote, in Montana, we all understand the importance of bipartisanship, but we also have to consider the reality that we've got people at the state and federal level who are trying to undermine the core of our democracy. Bipartisanship is important, but the most important thing is passing bills that will protect every voter's access to a ballot, unquote. In his calls for bipartisanship, Manchin is effectively giving Senate Republicans a veto on whether Washington should respond to an offensive against voting rights that red state Republicans are advancing. Martinez Fisher echoed all of the state-level officials I spoke with when he told me that although the bipartisanship Manchin wants on voting rules might be ideal, it ignores the reality of how Republicans are acting in the states today. Quote, you have a very noble standard in Washington as to how you'd like to operate, but when you pull the curtain back, you are going to see hyperpartisanship at its worst, unquote, he said. Manchin has been vague and elusive on why bipartisanship should be the standard for voting laws in Washington when it's clearly not the rule in the states, or why he believes that congressional Republicans will agree to undo the partisan advantages their state counterparts are pushing into law. His office did not respond to a request for comment on those questions. Privately, other Democrats and voting rights advocates have debated whether he is being naive or disingenuous in insisting that a critical mass, by the way, disingenuous is, of course, a highfalutin word for dishonest, so you don't have to call people dishonest, in insisting that a critical mass of Senate Republicans will ultimately vote to protect voting rights. Yes, disingenuous is the civil counterpart of dishonest, of not calling a spade a spade. The new Brennan data, by so starkly documenting the partisan nature of the offensive against voter access underway in the states, may point the needle further towards disingenuous as the explanation if Manchin remains adamant in his refusal to act without Republican consent. Well, that was an extremely competent summary of what is going on around the country in many states and what is happening to bipartisanship in many states. And of course, if one allows those voting situations to stand, we might soon have the same thing in Washington, where there again will be no bipartisanship because the Republicans will be able to ram everything through in both the House and the Senate without ever consulting any Democrats. That is, I think, certainly likely to happen. So there's Joe Manchin out there all by himself with extreme disingenuousness. So here's a piece from Jacobin. And the title of that piece, which is by Branko Marcetic, is "The Democrats Aren't Powerless to Flip Joe Manchin." And this piece was written on June 14th, just a couple of days ago. And the subtitle is "Democratic Leaders Claim to Be Powerless Against a Handful of Conservative Democrats Blocking Progressive Reform. Yet when it comes to government surveillance or funding war, those Democrats always know how to force rank and file lawmakers to fall in line." And the article itself, and the Democratic Party and the country as a whole are in a unique dilemma. Democrats, liberals, and even the center seem to have finally woken up to just how dangerously extreme the modern GOP is, with Republicans openly working around the country to suppress the votes, and if that fails, ensure they can overturn the result if it doesn't go their way. Democrats could theoretically head this off with the voting rights bill they have vowed to pass, but to do so, they'd have to first abolish or drastically reform the Senate filibuster, and that idea is opposed by two conservative Democratic senators, Kyrsten Sinema and especially West Virginia's Joe Manchin. Okay, I wonder if people are giving Joe Manchin too much credit, in the sense that everybody seems to be assuming that if Joe Manchin decides to support the voting rights bills, or a good voting rights bill, that Kyrsten Sinema is just going to fall in line. I hope that's right. And to be sure, her polling popularity in Arizona continues to tank. I haven't had time to look at the video about this, but I suspect that her approval rating now is way down in the 30s somewhere. It had fallen to 39, and since then there's new polling out. It seems to have fallen even further. So she's not looking good for 2024 unless she starts to change her spots back to what she used to be. Reportedly, President Joe Biden, who was sold to the electorate as the experienced insider, and consummate deal-maker who would make Washington finally work, has no plan to induce Manchin to switch. In fact, despite pledging to, quote, fight like heck with every tool at my disposal, unquote, Joe Biden's so clean, he won't even say hell. Fight like heck with every tool at my disposal, unquote, to get the voting rights bill passed. Biden has instructed civil rights groups not to pressure Manchin in private meetings. This is because, according to The Atlantic's Ronald Brownstein, and in line with the suspicions of frustrated voting rights groups, the White House doesn't see that legislation as a priority. The senior official told Brownstein they see the most viable path to defeating the GOP's anti-democratic plans as passing Biden's agenda in order to win elections in 2022. So we keep control of the House and Senate. Joe Biden, how are you going to win elections in 2022 if your most loyal voters can't cast a vote? Why will it matter then whether you pass your agenda or not? If you're going to lose 10 to 15% of the vote because of these voter restrictions, how the hell are you going to win any purple states? How are Democrats going to be returned to the Congress? Yeah, they'll be returned in bright blue districts. By the way, that's where a lot of the progressives are. But the blue dog Democrats you and Nancy Pelosi love so much, they're going to be gone because they're in the purple districts. So for the sake of the blue dog Democrats, you better get that voting rights bill passed, or they are toast. Going on with Branko Marcetic's piece. Yet that plan is also stalled for the same reason. Manchin refuses to back Biden's infrastructure bill. Hey, is this guy a Republican or what? Demanding it have GOP buy-in. So for weeks now, nothing has happened as Biden engages in fruitless negotiations with Republicans who will never support his bills, offering to cut more and more from the bill to get them on board, and jeopardizing what might very well be the last chance to do anything meaningful on climate change for a long time, as well as undermining future economic recovery. I got news for Joe Biden. If you don't do anything meaningful on climate change, and you don't do it now, then why should we care if the Republicans are returned in 2022? Because they're just going to do the same thing. They're not going to do anything meaningful on climate change. And if you're not going to do anything meaningful on climate change now, why should we vote for you in 24? Because then you're unlikely to do anything meaningful on climate change then. Now you have a majority in both houses of Congress. Now is the time to do something meaningful, Joe Biden. I'm going to give you some advice. I've given you this advice before. I'm going to give you the advice again. You do 3 things. You mint the $100 trillion coin. Get it deposited in the mint's account at the Federal Reserve. Get the Treasury Department to sweep that account for the coin seigniorage, almost $100 trillion into the Treasury spending account. Now, you won't be able to spend it without congressional appropriations. That's true. But it will be there, and everybody will see that there's no problem paying back the national debt, and everybody will see that deficit spending for good things for the public is easily affordable because the money is already there in the Treasury spending account. It only remains for the Congress to appropriate it, which puts the pressure on the Congress to appropriate, doing nice things and doing necessary things like legislation on the Green New Deal. That's number one. Number two, forgive all the student debt right now. That is within your power. It will make you instantly far more popular. Your approval rating will rise by 15 points. It will be up towards 70%. Your bargaining power with Joe Manchin will be increased significantly if you're at 70 to 75% in the polls, as opposed to the lousy 54% you've got right now. Capiche? Capiche, Joe Biden? And then the third thing you've got to do is declare a national emergency due to COVID. I think it's already been declared by Trump. All you got to do is just keep talking about the national emergency due to COVID and then activate Section 1881A of the Social Security Act, which allows you to give free Medicare coverage to everybody in the United States because it's a national emergency. Now, yes, I know it won't be Medicare for all because that's an enhanced Medicare program. It will only be the Medicare program we have now. But if it's delivered free to every American as part of the pandemic, this severely defrays the costs for everybody, including seniors who are now getting Medicare premiums taken out of their Social Security to the tune of $140 a month. You instantly help Social Security recipients that way. And you do it solely using the power of the presidency. What is that going to do for your popularity, Joe Biden? If you forgive the student debt and you do this third thing, you're going to be at 80% popularity. Let's see Joe Manchin stand up to you then, Joe Biden. In other words, maybe the way to get to Joe Manchin is not to do anything directly with Joe Manchin, but make yourself so much more popular and so much more powerful that Joe Manchin isn't going to want to screw around with you, Joe Biden. Going on with Branko Marcetic's piece. This is in line with what Brownstein's White House source told him that the agenda Biden's team sees as key to letting the party hold on to Congress in 2022 is about working to mitigate political conflict and compromising with Republicans. Biden, maybe you're too young to remember this. Maybe you didn't have an interest in politics during the 1950s and the 1960s. I know you ran for the Senate in 1972, and you were elected. A great young guy elected. But if you were around during the 1950s and 1960s and you were watching, that was the height of Republican bipartisanship, okay, with Democrats during those years. Tell me why, Joe Biden, It was because Democrats had been beating the hell out of them in the House and the Senate for years and years and years. And the only way they could win the presidency was with the war hero Dwight Eisenhower. The Republicans knew who the dominant party was. That was when there was bipartisanship. After the Democrats beat their heads in, then the only thing for them to do was to be bipartisan. If they expected to be reelected against a Democrat. So lots of people were bipartisan then. The way to make the Republicans bipartisan isn't to compromise with them from a position of weakness. It is to develop a position of dominance and then watch them come to you. You're analyzing the situation incorrectly. If you want bipartisan Republicans, you got to beat the pants off them first, Joe. That's the way politics works. You've forgotten that because you aren't paying attention to the history in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. This is in line with what Brownstein's White House source told him, that the agenda Biden's team sees as key to letting the party hold on to Congress in 2022 is about working to mitigate political conflict and compromising with Republicans, unquote. Unfortunately, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Democratic voter or party activist who shares this interpretation of the Democratic agenda they voted for, as even hardcore partisans are admitting. So much like Obama's agenda 12 years ago, Biden's is stuck thanks to obstinate Congresspeople and the ritual sacrificing of the progressive priorities that results is all but certain to produce the same thing as last time, a midterm shellacking that leaves the country ungovernable for 2 more years and puts the GOP in the driver's seat. But this scenario is even more alarming in the post-Trump world, with Republicans certain to not just further rig the rules in their favor, but at best do nothing about the accelerating threat of climate change. They're so bad, that there might not be a chance to do anything about climate change in 2029. And that's going to be too late, Joe Biden. You hold our fate in your hands. You cannot afford to be stupid about this any longer. And yes, you have been stupid about it. I'm not adopting any euphemisms like disingenuous or less than brilliant. Stupid is as stupid does. If only there was something, anything, that could be done to stop it. But there isn't. That seems to be the attitude of Democratic officials who have simply given up on passing their voting rights by legislation. As Jacobin's Luke Savage has pointed out, this kind of fatalism is strange given the stakes. Democratic rhetoric, whether it's from Biden or Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer or Stacey Abrams, is lately replete with warnings of democracy under threat and impending authoritarianism. Yet, despite controlling the White House and Congress, Democrats seem to feel all their options have been exhausted. It's a stark contrast to the GOP, which has responded to its electoral troubles with typical determined ruthlessness. But it's also a change from years past where when something was a big enough priority, a president and a party have typically done everything possible to find the votes. Think back to 2010 and the passage of the Affordable Care Act, which had been all but left for dead after a period of GOP time wasting in which Republicans used the same techniques they're now employing on Biden. Biden saw this. He saw it happen. The bill was resuscitated at the last moment by President Obama and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who were determined to ram it through. What followed was a full court press from the White House. Quote, he would do anything. He will call anyone, meet with anyone. He will speak anywhere. He will do whatever it takes, unquote. Obama's communications director later recalled the Democratic leadership. Both Obama and Pelosi relentlessly lobbied reluctant members, with the speaker simply refusing to accept failure. Quote, Nancy Pelosi, we will go through the gate. If the gate is closed, we will go over the fence. If the fence is too high, we will pole vault in. If that doesn't work, kind of reminds me of Winston Churchill. We will fight on the beaches. If that doesn't work, we will parachute in. But we are going to get health care reform passed. In her initial quest for votes, Pelosi had done everything from adding provisions to making promises to take up specific members' issues to getting a former university president to pressure his local representative. True, to get the bill over the line, Obama had to resort to an executive order to restrict abortion funds, while Pelosi had to give up on the public options. But all things considered, she was relatively uncompromising, refusing to break the bill into parts, as some White House advisors wanted. And yet, Branko Marcetic, that was not a sterling example of Democratic accomplishment. They got a bill over the finish line, yes, but they would have been better off trying to pass it quickly, and if they couldn't get it through the Congress, blaming the Republicans every step of the way until the elections in 2010. They could have run on that, on the Republicans blocking that. Instead, they passed a lousy bill that was unpopular and that in great part led to their defeat in 2010. Not just the fact that they passed this lousy bill, but that they wasted more than a year in trying to get it passed, and that they sacrificed every good thing about that bill, and that they refused to try to pass the good bill, which was H.R. 676. So the Democrats, in spite of their persistence, did not cover themselves with glory in resorting to every technique to put through a bill that was a bailout for the insurance and the pharmaceutical industries. That is what happened, and we shouldn't be glorifying that. We should not be glorifying that. But it did illustrate a certain determination which today's Democrats, including Pelosi, don't appear to have. As Gary Andres, then a lobbyist and later a Republican staffer, explained at the time, a range of options was available to the president for the vote-whipping operation. Promises to help members fundraise, spending earmarks, recruiting interest groups to step up pressure, and offers of committee assignment and threats of punishment. Quote, the White House has its own candy store. It can bestow on lawmakers' districts or by making other policy changes through the power of the executive branch, he wrote about then. That reminds me, one thing that Biden could do, I suppose, is declare an emergency in congressional districts of all those who are willing to vote for his infrastructure bills, give them the free Medicare, and say to the other representatives, vote for this bill, and your districts will get on this too. I know that would be outrageous. Everybody would, Biden is being so unfair, being so unjust. What he's doing is unconstitutional. He's discriminating, blah, 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 blah. But the White House has that candy store In Roosevelt's time, he used to pressure people by saying, you vote against this bill, no post office for you. FDR was the post office Nazi. After all, the stakes were high, with healthcare stalled and no other major legislative achievements. Obama openly warned his entire presidency hinged on the effort. Biden has to do that too, with the American Jobs Plan and with the American Family Plan. And he's got to pass those through reconciliation this summer. And he better include the progressive priorities. And then, when the House passes that bill, no more Chuck Schumer cutting out stuff that Joe Manchin doesn't like. Keep the House bill intact. Make Joe Manchin vote against those bills with all the goodies for West Virginia if he dares. That's how to get this done. After you do the three actions, get your popularity up to 80%, then do what I just suggested, and you watch what happens to Joe Manchin. Pelosi didn't, continuing with Branko Marcetic's article, Pelosi didn't always do this for progressive ends. When in the wake of Edward Snowden leaks in 2013, reining in the NSA's mass surveillance program became a top priority for both the U.S. public and Congress, Obama worked furiously with the agency's director to peel votes away from the effort. Key was Pelosi, who aggressively lobbied wayward Democrats to torpedo the amendment, and whose efforts had, quote, a much bigger effect on swinging Democratic votes against the amendment than anything the director had to say, unquote. One committee aide told Foreign Policy at the time. Foreign Policy is a periodical well known to those in the foreign policy area. At the time, the bill went down by a narrow 205 to 217 the votes. They defeated a good bill, but it's still an illustration of the power of the speaker and the power of a president who wants something passed or wants something blocked. But Pelosi had been just one of the players years earlier in 2008 when both Democratic and Republican leaderships worked overtime to get that year's hated bank bailout over the line. After failing in September, after a weekend of negotiations, party leadership launched a flurry of lobbying while adding sweeteners, a few extra provisions around taxes, incentives, and disaster aid, and a promise from then candidate Obama to lawmakers who were black that he would back foreclosure relief legislation, a promise he swiftly broke, needing 12 House members to switch. They managed 58 instead, 33 Democrats and 25 Republicans in favor of that bank bailout bill. More Democrats than Republicans. Imagine that. 8 more Democrats than Republicans for that bank bailout bill. What a mistake. Should have let the banks go down. Then he could have gotten foreclosure relief legislation for people, anything he wanted for Main Street. Should have let the frickin' banks go down. It's instructive to look at Lyndon Johnson. the master Senate legislature, to whom Biden has been repeatedly likened by pundits. Johnson, who refused to water down civil rights legislation in the face of a wall of sudden obstruction and a mountain of procedural obstacles, was no doubt a singular figure, famously able to harangue and flatter lawmakers into voting his way. Also notoriously obscene in his efforts. But he was also willing to dispense with tradition and procedure and play hardball when the time called for it, to aggressively push his priorities, as recounted in Robert Caro's The Passage of Power. Upon ascending to the presidency and finding long odds for civil rights, tied up as they were in the Rules Committee, he took a rarely used measure that, in the New York Times words, quote, offends traditionalists, launching a discharge petition in the House to wrench control of the bill from the committee and send it to the floor. By the way, Biden needs to do that with the Medicare for All bill. Johnson didn't even have to get a majority of the House to sign. Once the signatures got close, the chairman, wanting to avoid embarrassment, did it himself voluntarily. Biden's got to do that to Richie Neal. Modern Democrats know how to play hardball too, to whip their own members, as they did to progressives in 2009. 5 months into his presidency, Obama sidestepped his promises to leave Iraq and Afghanistan and requested more funding to escalate U.S. involvement in the latter, hitting a wall of dozens of anti-war House Democrats. In many ways, the holdouts had the advantage, with public opinion heavily on their side. They were soon met with a wave of lobbying from both Democratic leadership and various White House officials to get them to flip. One House member, Lynn Woolsey, charged that the White House went so far as to threaten freshmen they would leave them hanging when it came time for re-election if they didn't vote the president's way. Quote, "We're not going to help you. You'll never hear from us again," unquote. She recounted them saying at the time, "It was enough to peel off 19 votes, and the measure passed." Okay, now I can give you an example. In 2015, there was a measure for trade promotion authority that the president wanted the House to pass. Democrats in the House were overwhelmingly against it because it would have cleared the way for passage of the TPP quickly. There were 188 Democrats in the House at that time, and 160 of them were opposed to that bill. They were led by Rosa DeLauro, a friend of Nancy Pelosi's. And by the way, Lynn Woolsey was a good friend, of Nancy Pelosi's too, even though she was co-chair of the CPC at that time. Anyway, what Pelosi did in 2015 is, with 7/8 of her caucus against her, she took a neutral stance. She allowed the 28 Democrats who were not part of the anti-TPA group, she allowed them to just vote the way they wanted. She allowed her leadership to vote in the way they wanted. She herself did not, until the very end, declare that she was against the Trade Promotion Authority, but she still left everybody free to vote the way they wanted. The TPA cleared by something like 3 votes in the House. It was a very close vote. You're telling me that Nancy Pelosi, if she had sided with the 160 Democrats, couldn't have peeled off 19 of the 28 Democrats who went over to the Republican side and voted with Obama for trade promotion authority? She could have done that in an instant. But she wanted the TPP, even though she voted against the TPA herself. Her neutrality was a false neutrality. But that was the kind of power that she had. Anyway, Branko Marcetic says, on Friday, I asked Lynn Woolsey, who represented a Central California district for 20 years and played a key role in forcing the first vote on ending the war in Iraq. By the way, Lynn Woolsey was for Medicare for All. Her congressional fellow at the time was Margaret Flowers when she was in Congress. In 2010, her congressional fellow was Margaret Flowers. Okay, Margaret was setting up sessions for her on Medicare for All. She even set up one on the Taiwan Medicare for All system, which was based on our Medicare system, and brought in speakers to speak in favor of Medicare for All. And her pal, Nancy Pelosi, is standing against Medicare for All, not even allowing it to come to a vote. Jeez. Going back to the article, I asked Woolsey, represented Central California District for 20 years and played a key role in forcing the first vote on ending the war in Iraq, whether she thinks a similar threat could be made to push someone like Manchin now. She said, isn't that what politics is about, give and take? I mean, what good is Manchin to the Democratic Party if he only votes with Republicans? It's common sense, I think. Personally, I think he's being given too much room already, unquote. Woolsey says she has faith in Biden's efforts to restore the country post-Trump. She believes he first needs to know he did as much as reasonably possible to get GOP support for his program before moving forward on a partisan basis. She notes that Biden may be applying pressure behind the scenes, but confesses some frustration that more apparently isn't being done, pointing to Trump's continued ability to push Republicans while no longer even in politics. And what are the Democrats doing to Manchin? Nothing, quote unquote, she says. One point of leverage could be the West Virginia governor's mansion. According to The Intercept's Ryan Grimm, Manchin still longs for the office he held in 2005 to 2010 and considered running for it in 2020. Could the very possible prospect of, boy, I wish he had, and that Paula Jean Swearengin would have become the Democratic senator from West Virginia? That would have been wonderful. Could the very possible prospect of losing a small but significant and disgruntled slice of the state's Democratic vote for his gubernatorial bid be enough to force Manchin's hand? It's true that the problem runs deeper than Manchin, who is being used as a human shield by other Democrats unwilling to take the heat he's getting. Yet their very reluctance to withstand that kind of pressure suggests that flipping Manchin could prove to be the proverbial levee whose breach brings the party's Senate members on board. Perhaps such moves are already in the works, and everyone involved is playing their cards close to their chest. But if not, it will be difficult for voters to swallow the idea that Democrats were unable to flip a far smaller number of members than they've managed to in times past when their agenda hinged on it. The stakes have never been higher. I think that Branko Marcetic is absolutely right about that. But I think that the strategy that Biden should be following, or to flip Manchin, is the strategy that I outlined here. It's a better strategy because it makes Biden much more powerful and also gives him some accomplishments for 2022. It strengthens his hand for 2022. If the Republicans fail to pass infrastructure bill with 100T sitting in the Treasury spending account, $100 trillion, what excuse are they going to give to voters? They won't be able to plead poverty. They won't be able to counsel austerity. Biden will be putting forth these big spending bills for the people, and they'll all be voting against it. On what grounds? That the bills are going to cause terrible inflation for the American people? Let them contend that. I'll take inflation versus jobs anytime and be on the job side. The job side always wins that conflict. Always, unless there is inflation. But if the fight is before inflation manifests itself, there will be a flood in Congress of people insisting they vote for the jobs, and they vote for paid family leave, and they vote for the American family plan. With that kind of money in the Treasury, even the Republicans had best just shut up and pass it. Okay, that's what I have to say tonight. I'll take your comments up in 1 second. I hope to have time to bring you two other very, very important pieces. One was by David Sirota and his mates, and it is on the Affordable Care Act, pointing out Care Act. And then another one, this is about bipartisanship again. Democrats' hardened position on infrastructure package as doubts about bipartisan deal grow. That's what's happening right now. And this piece is about Bernie Sanders, okay, and other Democrats. I'm going to go through that and comment on those tomorrow and add a few other pieces, okay, on the same subject. I'm also contemplating talking about some more about whole Washington and the movement there to pass a state-level Medicare for all bill. So that's kind of coming attractions for tomorrow. And right now, I will move to consider your comments. And Amber says, the weather is more temperate on the, I prefer the Oregon coast over Washington. Carmen says, hi friends, about to share as I hear warplane after warplane flying east out of the Miami area. Very concerned. That is very concerning. Why would they be flying east out of the Miami area? I know. They can't be going to bomb Gaza. That can't be why they're going. Steve Wolfbrand. Kay says, hi, Steve Wolfbrand. Steve says, hi, Kay, shared. Steve says, I wish the squad had the balls, okay, of Manchin. Ghost Art said, share. Maybe the squad has been working up to it. Maybe we're going to see over the next couple of weeks we may see a stand. We may see the progressives refusing to vote for any infrastructure compromise that does not have climate in it. They've been threatening that. The threats have been pretty open. Actually, Ro Khanna 2 days ago, in an interview on Rising, said that if there's a deal made, that the House is not going to pass the deal until the climate part of the infrastructure bill is passed first by the House and by the Senate. And if that happens, then they will pass the bipartisan infrastructure package. But until then, they're going to vote no on the bipartisan infrastructure package. And the reason why they're doing that is that they don't trust the good faith of the Senate to follow the passage of a bipartisan bill with a partisan reconciliation bill. He's saying, I don't trust, and we don't trust Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and other conservative Dems to follow through on their commitments to vote for a reconciliation bill with the climate measures in it. And by the way, Ro Khanna, while you're at it, make sure the climate infrastructure bill has the $15 an hour minimum wage in it. Get that back. You guys should never have folded on that early. You folded. You caved. Ghost Start said, share. Independent Left News says, Joe. Hi, Indie Left. How you doing? Kay said, I had to laugh today. HRC endorsed Nina Turner's competitor, and soon Nina's money went way up. It was overwhelming anyway. Yeah, laugh out loud. Actually, we gave a contribution to Nina today, didn't we? But it wasn't because of that. It was just because it was our time to give Nina, another contribution. That's all. Yeah, Bonnie asked me, and I said, well, we really want to see her in, right? So we got to do something. Steve Wolfman said, it's beautiful, Amber, as well as Northern California. Carmen Muniz says, 7 more planes since I posted the comment above. I hope it's military training exercise, but it's dark. And Steve Gonza says, leaked Zoom of Senator Manchin's call with billionaire donors this week. Manchin appeared to ask the Wall Street executives to use job offers to retiring GOP senators to preserve the filibuster via support for the January 6th commission. Well, that's really interesting. But there were no retiring GOP senators, as far as I know, who weren't going to vote to preserve the filibuster. They were all going to vote, to preserve the filibuster. So what's that about? I mean, why did he have to ask the Wall Street executives to do that? They were probably going to give job offers to the retiring GOP senators anyway. That's what they do. Carmen says, I detest Manchin. Kay says, no surprise there, Steve Gonzo. Kay says, the government is divided, not the voters. Carmen Muniz says, wow, 19 books. That's almost as many as yours, Doctor. Well, I hate to tell you, folks, I started off in academia. Well, I started off actually in private research firms, but then I moved into academia for a short time from 1971 through 1975. through the fall, okay, of 1975. If I had been, okay, in academia from then to now, I would have had 50 books out. I wrote 7 of my 11 books within 6 months. When I sit down to write, I'm not kidding. Steve Gonzo says Manchin currently serves as the chairman of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and also serves on the Senate Committee on Appropriations, the Senate Committee on Armed Services, and the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs. Why? Hashtag DemPublicons. Carmen says, damn it, stupid keyboard. Take that man word out. It's supposed to say, that's almost as many as yours, Doc. Actually, it's more than mine. I don't have 19 books out. Carmen says, fascist saboteur should be serving on the prison road crew. Kay says, Ohio has 2, shake my head. Steve Gonzo says, author Don Winslow shreds Joe Manchin for standing with racists in a new video on the wrong side of the bridge, quote unquote, hashtag Selma. Kay says, the one GOP who wants to run for governor here wants to get rid of the Medicaid expansion too here in Ohio, shake my head. This state gets worse and worse. Steve Gonzo says Schumer and Pelosi urging Democrats to go easy on Joe Manchin. Screw them. Kay says, I saw that, Steve Gonzo. They're almost as bad as he is. They're losers. They want to lose. But Lana says, Fox Noise is actually more accurate. Yeah, I know it is, Lana. Lana says, we also have the Centrist News or Noise Network. The Centrist Noise Network, yes. Kay says, I've been following Beto's community signups and meetings in Texas. Carmen and Kay, what about his community signups and meetings in Texas? And Carmen says, passing Juneteenth. What a pandering insult by our Congress. As black voters' oppression rages and Biden's crime bill keeps people of color enslaved to this day, continuing the black codes, Klan legislation of the House. Yeah, it's really totally hypocritical. Kay says Joe Manchin is dishonest and bought and paid for. Absolutely. Steve Gonzo says Texas grid can handle hot or cold. Abbott and Costello Cruz. Yes, Abbott and Costello Cruz. Yeah, yeah. Cruz does look a little like Lou Costello. Same general body type, right? Steve Gonzo says the Lincoln Project is further left than the entire TYT Dem so-called resistance, hashtag pathetic. Steve Wolfbrand says pandemic pretty much over here in LA. Masks are coming off. Not so fast. The Delta variant is multiplying very fast in the United States. Those who are not vaccinated are going to suffer deeply, deeply. They really are. They better get a hold of ivermectin quick. Kay says, they are saying vax people here in Ohio don't have to wear a mask too. Yeah, they're saying it here too. But I don't trust the others here. Okay, I wear my mask. We wear our masks when we go into stores, into enclosed spaces. Outdoors, we don't wear our masks. In the building here, where most of the people are vaccinated already, we don't always wear our masks. Like we went to the laundry room yesterday and did our laundry, and we did not wear our masks there. Evelina Pont says, which advisors is Mr. Bidening listening to? Certainly Stephanie Kelton. I doubt that he's listening to Stephanie Kelton. If he was listening to Stephanie Kelton, he might have minted the $100 trillion coin by now. Evelina says, certainly not. Yes. I spoke too fast. Kay says, I wonder if Biden ever figured that out. Shake my head. We should have had Bernie. And Carmen says, go Hulk. Must smash stupid Biden. Steve Wolfbrand said, none of us are truly safe until the entire planet is vaccinated. The mutant variants will still be possible until that happens. Absolutely. The mutant variants will be coming. Steve Gonzo says, at Hillary Clinton, I'm proud to endorse at Chantel Brown for Congress in the Ohio special election. Hashtag, hello, nobody. Kay says, Steve Wolfbrand, there was a caller on Hartman's show today who is a COVID long hauler. She said doctors won't even listen to any of them about symptoms. And she belongs to several groups, and they have said none all over this country are listening to any of them. Suicides are going up because sick care doctors will not listen and learn from that. But very sad. I hope Hartman told them about ivermectin, because I think that ivermectin may be able to help even long haulers. But also, I think it's been shown that vaccines help long haulers too. But I'm not sure about that. You have to double check that. I'm not entirely sure about that, but I'm pretty sure that ivermectin has been shown to have some effectiveness for long haulers. Carmen says, hate her too. Steve Gonzalez says, it's going to take more than Girl Scout cookies, beers, and joints. I'm researching the Novavax. Yeah, Novavax is looking pretty good. It supposedly has a 90% efficacy. It'll be a while till they have those vaccines out, I think. Carmen says, and by the way, they may be released to other nations first before they're plentiful here. Carmen says, it takes bold maneuvering by Biden. Sigh, he doesn't have the chutzpah. Don't you wish I was president, Carmen? Evelina says, they bailed out banks, not people. Unforgivable. Yep, that's what they did. Steve Gonzo, Hillary endorsements are the kiss of death. Joe Manchin is the Robert Byrd of Joe Biden. The Robert Byrd of Joe Biden's. Actually, if Joe Manchin was Robert Byrd, probably he would be supporting H.R. 1976 and working with Bernie Sanders in order to develop a Senate version of H.R. 1976. And also, by this time, with this kind of lack of bipartisanship, he would long since have been on the side of getting rid of the filibuster, entirely. Now remember, he was the one who cut the filibuster from 67 to 60. And he put in the reconciliation stuff also. I know from our perspective, it looks like he strengthened the filibuster as opposed to weakening the filibuster. But for the time involved and the context at that time, he was definitely weakening it. And he would weaken it again today if he were alive in order to get the voting rights bill passed and also in order to get a Medicare for All bill passed. He was strong for Medicare for all. And Jello J. Rockefeller, until his last years, was very strong for Medicare for all, too. Problem with him was, in his last years, he started caving over everything. I think he just got tired. Evelina Ponce says, Steve Wolfbrandt, you suppose she has sour breath? Kay said, she's just sour, Evelina Ponte, laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo said, are loogies sour? God, Steve. Steve Wolfbrandt said, Lyndon Johnson was an evil man who got so many killed in Vietnam, as well as orchestrating the killing of JFK. The Civil Rights Bill was the only saving grace. Well, I hate to tell you, but the Medicare bill was another saving grace. Nor do I think that Lyndon Johnson orchestrated the killing of JFK. I do not believe that for a minute. Not only don't I believe that for a minute, he did get many, many people killed, in Vietnam because he could not let go. And he was unwilling to risk World War III over Vietnam. But it was because he was the kind of guy he was, an overbearing egoist who got himself overly committed to Vietnam, and he could not let go. But still, he was in no way like Trump. He was not an evil and uncaring man. Steve Gonzo says, okay, and by the way, I was out there demonstrating against Lyndon Johnson at the time of the Vietnam War. And I was singing, he's knee deep in the big muddy and the big fool says to go on. So I was about all that at that time. But I never thought that Lyndon Johnson was intentionally evil. Steve Gonzo said, sour grapes and milk toast. It's a crime family, Evelina. Yes, the Clintons. Kay says, the Clintons ruined the Dem Party, in my opinion. I certainly think the Clintons helped, and they did a lot. But the ruination of the Dem Party in some ways started with Jimmy Carter and his fighting with the unions, and then continued with people coming into Congress, a new wave of Democrats who thought they knew better than the New Dealer. One of them in the Senate was Bill Bradley, who was for balanced budgets, and Paul Simon in the Senate, who was for balanced budgets, and Richard Gebhardt, in the House. New Democrats. Remember, the New Democrats started to appear in the late 70s and the early 80s. And Clinton did not become a real factor until the late 80s. So there were people preceding Clinton dragging down the Democratic Party because they distrusted the old-time religion of the Democratic Party, when it was that precise religion that they needed to beat the Reaganites. Steve Gonzo said, Biden's Twitter is getting dragged for his election interference BS. Sorry, I scrolled down too fast. Evelyn said, realistically, what will Biden do before 2022? I don't know what he will do. People do different things when their backs are against the wall. Manchin is pushing Biden's back to the wall, and the Republicans, okay, are doing the same thing. When that happens, some people will simply cave. A lot of people will simply cave and go home, okay, and eat ice cream. I don't know whether Biden is going to do that, okay, or Biden is not. He is 78. Maybe he wants to do something important before it's all over for him. If he does, he's going to have to start to innovate. He's going to have to start doing different things. He's going to start having to throw a lot of things against the wall and see what sticks. Whether he'll do that or not, I don't know. Evelyn says, realistically, what will Biden do before 2000? I read that already. And Evelyn says, right before the elections. Well, he can't do it right before the elections because the Congress doesn't want to pass anything right before the elections. If he's going to do anything, it's got to be between now and the end of the year. If he does things next spring, it could well be too late. If the things are relatively feeble things, like the Affordable Care Act was, it won't pull the election of 2022 out of the fire for him. He's got to do big things. Now, I think he's got to do the big things this year and get on top of it. And he has to pass the voting rights bills. He must have those. The Republicans must not be able to get away with gerrymandering in 2022. That has to go. Carmen says, I like what's on the menu for tomorrow. Kay says, I'm not counting on much from Biden. Evelyn Napont, hope he surprises me, but not holding my breath. Well, none of us should hold our breaths. That's unhealthy. But don't be completely surprised if he starts doing something important. And Carmen says, skies went totally quiet, but listen out for U.S. military strikes somewhere in a couple of days. Maybe. That would be terrible. Seth Rich was murdered for leaking emails to WikiLeaks. Epstein didn't kill himself. Gary Webb was killed by CIA. Our own government did on 9/11. Bill Clinton and Bush Sr. smuggled tons of cocaine into Mena Airport in Arkansas. And Michelle, well, you know. Steve. And Steve Woolbridge said, and then there's Fred Hampton, RFK, MLK, and the list goes on. What a wonderful country. So, half that is certainly true. Like Fred Hampton, RFK, MLK, probably Seth Rich. I don't know about the rest. And Biden says Putin is a killer. Laugh out loud. Such hypocrisy. Yeah, that is hypocrisy. With what Biden is doing, in Yemen, that is hypocrisy. Even when it says the cynicism. And Steve Wolford says Biden's progressive dementia gets worse every day. Steve Wolfman says, yes, Doc, the vaccine helps long haulers most times. Carmen says, I haven't had a chance to see Dr. Campbell today, but his new notification mentioned ivermectin today. Yeah, he was talking ivermectin. He was calling on Dr. Fauci. He was calling on, I think the guy's name is Chris Short, okay, in England, big shot, England. He was calling on Tedros, calling on them all to make statements about ivermectin. He was reporting on an ivermectin study. He definitely believes that the evidence is there that ivermectin is effective against COVID. He thinks the statistical evidence is compelling. Also, Dr. Bean is always talking scientific studies in almost every episode he does. Many of the scientific studies concerning new evidence about the effectiveness, okay, of ivermectin. I heard something today that I hadn't known before. I heard it actually from Dr. Campbell, specifically, that the Nobel Prize for Medicine was won by the developer of ivermectin in 2015. In 2015. That's how mainstream it was. And that's how mainstream it is for certain treatments. But these top-level administrators from scientific organizations are trying to keep dark the news that it's likely to be effective in various stages of COVID as a preventative, in the early stages, as an antiviral, as an anti-inflammatory, and as a help for long-haul COVID afterwards. They don't like ivermectin because it costs between $3 and $12 a dose, depending on where you get it. There are very few side effects. It's among the safest drugs you can take, but it's off patent, of course. And there's nobody making huge profits from it. Evelyn says, well, won't it keep them from getting infected again? Which they can viven, the Mirani, which they can, given the mutants. Yes. Dr. Mobeen, whenever he goes into risky situations where he thinks there are going to be crowds, okay, or things like that, he prepares himself by giving himself a dose of ivermectin. Now that's what he does. He figures that it gives him protection for a month. If he does it, uses it as a prophylactic. Lana says, Bird was actually good toward the end of his life. Perhaps only bring up that he was originally terrible. Okay, people only bring up he was originally terrible. Okay, but when it came to racist issues, he was. He was a member of the Ku Klux Klan when he was young. That's how terrible he was. But as he got older, he changed. He became a very good friend of Teddy Kennedy's. And they worked together for many, many years, okay, on many things. And at the end, he was not anti-civil rights. He was pro-civil rights. By the way, Hugo Black, the famous Supreme Court justice, who was on the very left end of the court for years and was appointed by Roosevelt, was also a Klan member in his youth. And of course, he was one of the unanimous votes in Brown versus Board of Education that created school integration. that prepared the way for the end of segregation in the United States. And black, from the end of the war on, was always for civil rights and civil liberties, not just civil rights, but civil liberties too. One of the strongest defenders of free speech and free press and free assembly to ever sit on the Supreme Court. And one of the greatest justices ever to sit on the Supreme Court. When he was young, he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. People can change. Steve Wolfbrand says today there is no excuse for ignorance. You can Google anything, do your research. Yeah, but the problem is you can Google anything, you can get lots and lots of things that come back. We all do our research, Steve. But a lot of what comes back is crap. You have to have sufficient discrimination to separate the crap from the truth. It's not about getting a bunch of info out there. It's about culling the info, treating it intelligently. Bush Sr. was also involved in JFK's murder. Oh, come on. Kay says, my parents were among the first to get Medicare back then. People before then paid in double for many years so they could get it now. People paid double after the compromise Tip O'Neill made with Reagan in 1983. They both were propounding the myth that Social Security could not be funded unless there was money in the trust fund, when it had nothing to do with the trust fund. Now I get a whopping $684 a month. Shake my head. Half of that comes from my first hubby. Wow. $684 a month. How can you possibly live on that? How is it possible? Really, it's just incredible. Lana says, yes, the Democratic Leadership Council was a big shift to the right by Clinton Gore with a few dollars from the Koch brothers to recapture the Reagan Democrats. And Steve Wolfbrand said 2022 will be a disaster for the Democratic Party. It's shaping up that way. If Biden doesn't do his stuff and get Manchin and Sinema to come along, it's going to be a disaster for the Democratic Party. Evelina, do you think anything he does in foreign policy will affect 2022 Dem elections? No, I don't. I think the attention of the country is solely on climate issues. It's on the domestic issues. It's on the democracy issues. And it's on what he's trying to do with the American Jobs Plan and the American Family Plan. Those are the things that are going to affect the 2022 Dem elections. They have to pass H.R. 1K and H.R. 4. Carmen says, just leave the U.S., Wolfbrand, hopefully where there's no internet. Kay says, but mainstream media news has been all about the Biden-Putin summit. Shake my head. Not much important there, okay, in my opinion. Yeah, I think Biden will work out his relations with Putin. I don't think there's going to be a problem with Putin. I think Biden will work out his relations with the Chinese too. I don't think there's going to be a war with either or both. Even when it says, what would make him truly unpopular with his base? Joe Biden? What would make him truly unpopular with his base is failing in the same way Obama failed. failing to do anything that people liked. Now, he's done one thing that people like. People liked the American Rescue Plan. That's why his approval rating is at 54 right now. But that's not enough to get him through. It's going to go down. As it goes down, that will affect the congressional prospects, of Democrats. If they don't stop the gerrymander that's going forward with all these state bills, nothing is going to help the Democrats. They're going down big time in 2022. Steve Gonzo says, Jon Stewart went airborne on Colbert, laugh out loud. Carmina says, but Utah has 413 new cases of COVID. Wow. Is there a vaccination problem, in Utah? Are they insisting that the vaccination's a farce? And what's going on, in Utah? I know Trump wasn't very popular there. Their conservatism was of a different kind. So what's causing? Well, it might be just the spread of the Delta variant. Evelina says, I agree, but seems the med, I can't stop talking about it. Of course, it's a distraction. It seems that the media can't stop talking about it. Of course, it's a distraction. Carmen Muniz says the most in 1 month. Oh, that's a bad sign. That's a bad sign. I think it means that the Delta variant is out west and is already doing tremendous damage out west. I read something today which indicated that there's a likelihood many of our deaths going forward are going to be in red states because the people are refusing to vaccinate. Kay says, I'm sick of hearing it, Evelina. And Evelina says, me too. Steve says, China's developing AI fighter jets. Well, I'm sure they are. I think we have developed AI fighter jets ourselves for some time. Carmen says, those planes may be heading to China over Taiwan issue. Just saw something in the news, but it's not totally clear if that is the reason. Why? Is China preparing an attack on Taiwan? Are they envious of Medicare for all in Taiwan? No, I'm joking. Of course, I know that they consider Taiwan to be a part of China, and they do so with justification. And Kay says, I can't live on it without a lot of help. But from my roommate, and SS, they pay for my Medicare. Lana says, also the vaccines. Steve Gonzo says, the Sun hashtag by U.S. scrambles F-22 fighter jets and moves carrier strike group to front up to hashtag Russian war games ahead of Biden-Putin talks. The U.S. scrambled F-22 fighter jets and moved the carrier strike group to front up a Russian war. Hashtag trends by HT News One Place, U.S. Russia Putin, F-22 Biden scrambles. But his talks with Putin are over now. He was on his way home. I don't understand what that's about. It'll clear up, in a day or so. Kay says, I'm terrified of being homeless if something happens to Jeff. Carmen says, yeah, the Delta variant is infecting vaccinated people as well. Evelyn says, I meant unpopular as far as foreign policy, like declaring war or failure to declare it. Uh, nope, I really don't think that's going to affect things. I mean, it might affect things if he fails on the domestic front. But if he's a successful president with the programs that have been introduced or that are on the floor of Congress now, and he passes a lot of popular stuff, then even declaring war or failure to declare war is probably not going to destroy his chances for reelection in 2024 if he wants to be reelected. And also, it probably will not affect the chances of the Democrats in 2022. I know the country will not like fighting a war again. It will be unpopular. But if he does the other popular things, he'll probably be able to withstand that. Steve says, it's Utah. They're hillbilly anti-vaxxers. What did you expect? Well, in Utah, they take care of each other also. So I kind of expected that they might actually be pretty good when it came to vaccinations and things like that. Carmen Yunus says 10 Dems and 11 Republicans sign on to bipartisan infrastructure. Well, the 11 Republicans, are enough to pass it. So now all Biden has to do is to get his Democratic caucus to agree to pass it. All the progressives have to do is to insist that they're not passing anything until the progressive priorities in infrastructure get passed as a reconciliation bill first. After that, they will not vote against the bipartisan infrastructure bill. They need to stick to that deal. They need to not fold at all. They need to not take anybody's words, because they give their words and then they have a million excuses why they're not able to follow through. How many promises has Biden already abandoned? There's a whole litany of promises that he's already abandoned. I mean, the $2,000 check promise. There was an explicit promise for $2,000. Then there was the $15 an hour. Big shot, $15 an hour. He's backing $15 an hour. All he had to do to get that through was to tell Chuck Schumer to keep it in the bill, bring it to the floor with that in the bill, and then dare Manchin and Sinema to vote against the American Rescue Plan. That would have been a death warrant for them, a figurative death warrant, in terms of their getting reelected. Even if Manchin wanted to get out of the Congress and become governor of West Virginia again, it would have been a death warrant for him. Steve says, Kay, you can always hit me up if you get desperate. Don't lose sleep over it. Wow, Steve, that is a generous offer. Carmen says, China is doing some oceanic drenching around Taiwan to sabotage them. Haven't read an article yet. I see. Oceanic drenching around Taiwan. That's interesting. Kay says, are you going to come and get me, Steve Wolfbrand? Kay says, my niece just died on Utah. So sorry, Kay. That is really terrible. Evelyn asks whether it was from the virus. Carmen says, good live stream again tonight. You rock. Thank you, Carmen. Kay says, not sure exactly, but from what I heard, it seemed like it, Evelina. He says, probably not. I'm not rich, just a gambler that gets lucky sometimes. Seriously, though, I'd be there for you. Kay says, well, I need somewhere else to go, Steve. Lana says, that's the next thing we need to rally for. An uptick for Social Security and Social Security disability. Absolutely. That is absolutely necessary. Absolutely. There's a bill somewhere that not only wants to expand Social Security, like the Warren bill is like, we'll expand Social Security by $200 a month. That's a big deal. Yeah, BFD. But there's a better bill that would raise the minimum level of Social Security up to the poverty level, something like, I think I read somewhere it was $1,400 a month, actually. Lift everybody to at least $1,400 a month. That would be helping Kay, I think. Lana says, sorry to hear about that, Kay. Carmen says, but if Manchin is promised a corporate job, what does he care if he doesn't get reelected? He cares. It's known that he wants to be the governor of West Virginia again. He loved that job. That's why he cares. Of course, he likes being the center of attention in the Senate also. So that's important. Steve Wolfbrand says, good night, you all. Good night, Steve. Lana says, very nice of you, Steve. Carmen says, by re-elected correction. Kay says, but Larson has a better bill out of Connecticut. Yeah, I know there are better bills out there. Carmen says, Social Security increase will just make the renter's price gauge. It could do something like that. The way that BlackRock is buying property up, houses up all over the United States, they're trying to make everything a rental market where they have control of rents. Kay says he knows it still won't get passed, so is sitting on it. It has over 200 backers. Okay, everybody, it's time to say good night. So good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. I'll be back tomorrow night. And I'll be talking tough again, I promise. Good night. And good night, Kay. Okay, and we love you too. And Steve Gonzo says, Senator Sherrod Brown, Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, Ron Wyden, 18 Senate Democrats just reintroduced the SSI Restoration Act in the Senate. As Senator Brown notes, this vital program has been forgotten by Washington for over 30 years. And Lana says good night. Dolores says thank you and good night all. Kay says thank you for another great discussion. I love you all. And we love you too, Kay.